So now we're gonna be watching the Austrian Absolutism, but of the Habsburg Empire, 1765 through 1790 by Old Britannia.
Made by Maria Theresa's second daughter of the Habsburg family at home. Francis Stephen is shown in dressing gown and slippers with a towel wrapped around his head. The Queen herself is pouring coffee, whilst children clamber about beneath them. It's an amusing scene, illustrating that behind the cold and rigid facade of Spanish court etiquette that dominated life in the Hofburg, there was a quaint domesticity to be found among the imperial family. By the end of the 7 Years' War, Maria Theresa had borne 16 children, 11 of whom still survived. With ages ranging from 24 to 6, her daughters, all creatively named some variation of Maria, were to marry into the great courts of Europe over the following years. That was, in effect, their only purpose as far as the Queen was concerned, despite her own inadequate education, because of which she often felt inferior. There was little attempt made by Maria Theresa to address this issue with her female children. They are born to obey, the Queen once snapped. More was expected of the sons, most of whom were destined to rule smaller Italian or German principalities. Of the archdukes, Charles had been the most attractive in personality before a premature death at just 15. The third son, Leopold, was the opposite. Cold, reserved and haughty, a bad student, his tutor wrote a despairing report of the prince's character, and he was considered the least able of the children. Then there was Joseph. No Habsburg monarch has provoked more debate than Maria Theresa's first son and heir. To some, an arrogant, conceited and self-important man, whose reign drove the empire to the edge of catastrophe. For others, he is a tragic figure, hard-working, enlightened, failing only because his vision for the monarchy was so before its time. He was born on the 13th of March 1741. Unlike with her daughters, Maria Theresa was determined the son would have an education befitting a Habsburg emperor. Yet if the Queen expected the young Joseph to be shaped in her image by his Jesuit tutors, she was to be disappointed. Reading widely, instead of God and Church, he discovered Voltaire and the Enlightenment. The Archduke was not considered a good student as far as his teachers were concerned, but privately he studied everything from law, history and economics to politics and government. This keen interest in the state and power was combined in a prince that clearly understood the high position he had been born into. He has the most exalted conception of his station, reported the Prussian ambassador to Frederick. Given his own regiment of troops while still a child, Joseph marched up to Haugwitz, then engaged in transforming the Austrian military from a mob of armed peasants into a disciplined force capable of fighting Frederick to a stalemate. "Did you ever do service in the army?" the young Archduke asked. Haugwitz replied he had not. "Then why do you meddle in matters you do not understand?" It might seem unfair to characterise a man based on childhood anecdotes such as this, yet Joseph's conceit only seems to have increased with age. He expects to be obeyed and honoured, finds criticism unpleasant, almost intolerable indeed, gives way to all his own whims, but behaves discourteously, even rudely, to others, huffed Maria Theresa in one letter. On the other hand, we have numerous reports of him being charming, gentle, and even kind to all classes, high and low. Certainly, he knew from an early age what was required of a monarch in a social setting, and for a time, love mellowed him. At 19, to strengthen the recently established alliance with France, Joseph married Louis XV's granddaughter, Isabella of Parma. He did so, as he announced to anyone that would listen, only for the good of Austria, writing to one friend, "I am extremely worried about my future happiness. I am certainly not entering this state out of curiosity or bestial lust. Only the thought of duty brings me to this, which costs me infinitely and disgusts me. A victim of the state, I am sacrificing myself, hoping that God will repay me." This God apparently did. Isabella arrived at the Habsburg court in late 1760. Aged 18, with olive skin, lively eyes and a charming personality, Joseph allegedly went red upon first seeing her. Within weeks, the enlightened rationalist was in love. Isabella was genuinely one of the most remarkable princesses in history. She was not only talented in music, conversation, and all the other social pursuits expected from a lady of this era, but was also well read in a range of subjects from economics to law. When she was not dealing with the trials of court life, she was writing an essay on the internal trade situation, moral philosophy, or one of her more famous works, such as The Fate of Princesses, an early criticism of the arranged marriage market that defined a noble woman's life in those days. She was careful to display this intellect gently, offering her husband advice where appropriate, without making this still rather insecure man feel inferior. And within months, Isabella was also in love, just not with Joseph. In over 200 surviving letters, she confesses her romantic devotion instead to his sister, Marie Christine. It would be crude to speculate too wildly on this subject. Marie Christine's letters have not survived, though she seems to have returned Isabella's affection, even if the Archduchess was to later have a happy marriage to the Duke of Teschen. Whatever the case, already prone to depression, Isabella's romantic feelings only served to deepen her despair. Endowed with all the gifts of life, she longed for death. When a smallpox epidemic struck in 1763, she practically shooed the doctors away. Within 5 days of contracting the disease, she was dead. Joseph, who had remained by her bedside the entire time, was devastated. I never feel more consoled when I am alone in my room, looking at the portrait of my beloved wife, reading through her writings and works, he wrote to his father-in-law soon after. I have preserved all the slightest scraps of paper left by this adorable woman. I want to be able always to show the world what a companion I possessed in her, and how much she deserves to be mourned. He had been married too short a time for Isabella to seriously mellow his personality, but she had undoubtedly brought out the best in him. He did not lose the charm or kindness he had always been known to display to others, but neither did he overcome the arrogance, self-pity and authoritarianism that were also a part of his character. A widow at 22, he returned to the world of cold rationality and applied himself to affairs of state. The next year he was taken by Francis Stephen to Frankfurt, where he was elected by the German princes as King of the Romans, a title that allowed him to automatically become emperor upon the incumbent's death. The loss of Isabella had brought back his natural aloofness, and he was bored by the antiquated rituals and sermons that supplemented his coronation. He complained in a letter to his mother of the trash and idiocies which we had to listen to all day. Yet his brother Leopold records he was charming, cordial and happy with everyone he met, as was expected of him.
Very interesting guy. Like I said, I apologize for my silence. The thing is, it's like, I'm not gonna pretend that I'm I don't even have, like, basic knowledge on the Habsburgs, guys. Like, I'm, like, very ignorant, so I'm just trying to absorb as much as I can at the moment and learn, you know, which isn't always the funnest thing when you're not saying much, but, you know. I will say, I do find his personality, it's like, yeah, you could point out at some things. Obviously, he got criticized later on for, you know, aloofness, sort of, and all that. But he also is not, like, ruled by that. He can play the role, even if he doesn't like it, of, you know, of a more benevolent side. And, yeah, overall, he does seem to have a mind on him. Though I don't think we've gotten into the meat of what he does. I think we'll probably have more to say when we see when he finally takes the reins and what exactly he does. Though the idea of rejecting the whole religion with more enlightenment is interesting. It seems like he's setting it up for him to be an enlightened monarch. And definitely probably push Austria to a completely new direction. So yeah, I will say I do find it interesting how Maria, as mentioned earlier, kind of expected her children mainly to you know, be married and whatnot. You know, considering that she wasn't put in the best position, you know, you think she would want, like, her kids to be more like daughters and whatnot, to be more educated. But I guess while open-minded, definitely, there are some aspects, I guess more traditional aspects, that she did keep. So, I don't know, I did find that a little interesting.
However dull he found it, Joseph knew why this pageantry was more necessary now than ever. Habsburg rule over the empire, once the greatest power on the continent, but now a decentralised grouping of over 300 virtually independent Central European states, large and small, had been shaken by Charles of Bavaria's election to the imperial throne in 1742, and Prussia's subsequent rise to power. Joseph's coronation as Francis Stephen's heir was thus a symbolic reassertion of Habsburg control. And so, whatever his private opinions, the young Archduke smiled, greeted and charmed. He was learning the role of monarch quickly. It was well he did so. In 1765, Francis Stephen unexpectedly died. Maria Theresa went into a state of mourning that she would remain in for the rest of her life. She talked of retiring to a convent and leaving the government to Joseph, who automatically ascended the imperial throne upon his father's death. That she did not abdicate was undoubtedly for the best, but it created a slightly bizarre situation where the Holy Roman Emperor, officially the greatest prince in Germany, had no actual power base of his own. The Habsburg monarchy itself was legally still in the hands of Maria Theresa. The Queen understood though that Joseph needed to be brought into government. He was still only 24, but clearly ambitious and eager for power. Indeed, he had effectively run the Habsburg monarchy for several months whilst Maria Theresa mourned. Thus, she agreed to a co-regency. Maria Theresa would maintain supreme authority over internal affairs, but Joseph would take control of foreign policy, the army, and less fully, administration and finance. Again though, Joseph's power as co-regent descended solely from his mother. Like any other minister, he could be dismissed by the Queen at any point for whatever reason. Practically though, the young emperor now had a large degree of control over one of Europe's great powers, and from the start he worked hard. Within a month of his father's death, he described a typical day as follows. I am overwhelmed by business and audiences. I get up at 6:30, go to mass, and at 8 o'clock begin sitting at my table. He then began work on imperial affairs. At 10, a roll call of Habsburg ministers appeared. At 12:30, he took a morning report to Maria Theresa. At 1, Prince Kaunitz would arrive for an hour and a half appointment before lunch. Afternoons and evenings were spent either sorting through his father's papers or attending more meetings. He complained to Leopold that he sometimes had to give 60 audiences a day, and had 100,000 projects in his head. It did not help that many of his mother's ministers also saw fit to die around this time. Haugwitz went within a fortnight of Francis Stephen, and the great old Marshal Daun soon after. Maria Theresa slowly returned to state affairs, but her zeal for government, and with it reform, was very much gone. Instead, she devolved yet more power to Kaunitz. The Queen seems to have intended on using him as a foil to Joseph's growing control over the administration. In this she was successful, but it came at the cost of giving this rather crackers individual, who was already leading minister, yet more power. In 1765, Kaunitz's great idea of a Franco-Austrian alliance to recover Silesia had clearly failed, and he had no new ones. Worse, he seemed to become more unhinged by the day. His daughter-in-law thought him the most eccentric individual she had ever met. After Maria Theresa nearly died during an outbreak of smallpox in 1767, the Chancellor apparently decided he was the person most impacted by the drama, distributing this circular to colleagues. I was so keenly affected by the thought of this illness that since then I have not been able to hear its name without shuddering. I earnestly beg you never to speak in my presence of this malady in question, and when you are reading to me anything whatsoever, please be most careful never to read out sections which concern this matter, or might be connected with it. In
4 years of school?
of all this, no one doubted Kaunitz's ultimate competence in the role. Successive British ministers deplored his steadfast commitment to France, but all acknowledged his talent. His great plan to recover Silesia had failed, but the Queen knew it had been a bold stroke which very nearly succeeded. And there was likewise no question of his incorruptibility, indeed so much so that Kaunitz would frequently vex Maria Theresa over the following decade, balancing Joseph's more extreme opinions at times, then siding with him against the Queen at others. This triumvirate, with all its bickering and brilliance, was to rule the Habsburg monarchy for 15 years. In those first months after Joseph's accession though, it was he that drove forward policy. He donated most of the substantial private fortune left to him by Francis Stephen to the state, reducing the heavy post-war national debt. He took an axe to household expenditure in everything from stables to boar hunting. Outward displays of pageantry and pomp which often cost a small fortune, were also trimmed back as much as was realistically possible for a monarchy so wrapped up in ancient tradition. With these acts, he was able to negotiate a reduction in the interest on the national debt, standing at nearly 300 million florins, from around 6% to 4%. He nonetheless despaired at the state of Austrian finances. There was no accurate account of the monarchy's revenues and expenses, too much was regularly wasted on dubious programmes, and an early attempt to introduce double-entry bookkeeping failed because officials apparently found it too difficult, even though every schoolboy masters it in 6 months, and annoyed Joseph huffed. The most significant action of his early rule, however, was not a policy or reform, but rather an essay written for his mother. Catchily entitled Memorandum on the Defects of the Present System and the Most Effectual Means of Remedying Them, this work of around 10,000 words is considered Joseph's manifesto of enlightened absolutism. In it, he rejects all theoretical systems in politics, declares no minister save Kaunitz has done anything useful in recent years, and attacks the sclerotic state of Austrian government. One example he offers is of committees set up to consider financial reforms that then spent more money deliberating than the actual reform itself would save. Deloitte apparently getting involved with 18th century projects these days. As such, he proposes several solutions. Departments should be merged for greater efficiency, restrictions and monopolies should be abolished on internal trade, the traditional stigma against nobles engaging in commerce should also be done away with, exports were to be encouraged, imports, except for spices, should simply be banned. Impositions must be equal, lord and peasant contributing in just proportions to the state. Meanwhile, the sovereign should reduce their personal expenditure as much as possible. How could the monarch think himself rich if he had money in his coffers but the provinces were depopulated and impoverished, Joseph asks. He then moves on to what he calls detached ideas.
Okay, so I need to say that it's an interesting aspect that this, Joseph kind of has to play this, like, triumvirate role with, his mom being, the ultimate power, still having to, answer to Maria, which is just an interesting dynamic that we haven't seen in, ever on this channel. So it's already an interesting thing. But yeah, it seems like she wants to curb his power in a sense, because obviously I think there are disagreements between the two, but like Joseph is taking an active role. Is he ambitious? Yeah, of course, but like, and he obviously wants more. I think he wants all of it. But there are some of what he's saying that I'm like, he's kind of spitting. Like, I kind of agree with what he's saying. It's kind of like a middle-class, normal lad at myself. Some of the stuff he's saying, like, that's cool, willing to give up his own personal riches, stop in extravagance and pomp in order to, create a better financial situation, more equality, I don't know, I just agree with a lot of what he's saying so far. I'm not sure that's about to, like, change dramatically. We have, like, a lot more time, but, there's a lot he's saying that, I agree with. Or I find myself like, actually, yeah, I like that idea. I like that idea you have, Joseph. Again, I'm, like, agreeing a lot with him so far. But obviously, as mentioned earlier, he's apparently a very polarizing figure among historians, so I'm just waiting for, like, the parts I don't agree to fully show up and be like, oh, whoosh, But so far, I kind of really like the guy so far. I don't know.
He bemoans the state of education, which he thinks too dominated by the church. He expresses his dislike of universities being situated in towns, which offer too many distractions to the students. Monasteries are a nuisance because they entice men of great potential to take holy vows at a young age. He becomes more radical in religious opinion as he continues. Immigration to the monarchy should be encouraged, but under present circumstances, where state policy was focused on suppressing Protestants and Jews, this was impossible. Non-Catholics should be employed by the state as readily as Catholics, Joseph declares. There is far more included on everything from army reform to how many courses should be served at dinner. It is an often incoherent document that sounds more like the ramblings of a first-year politics student than manifesto from a Roman emperor. The most obvious theme in the memorandum is that it serves as an implicit critique of Maria Theresa's administration. The great reforms she herself had undertaken before the 7 Years' War are judged inadequate by Joseph. The document, unsurprisingly, did not change Maria Theresa's thinking. She was by no means a mere reactionary, but the Queen had no interest in overturning the entire political, religious and social settlement of the monarchy in the way Joseph wanted. She gave Kaunitz the task of responding in full, which produced a flattering document that nonetheless countered the more absurd suggestions, such as moving universities out of major towns or the total banning of imports. Joseph seems to have at least taken Kaunitz's critique on board, and a further memorandum in 1768 showed a far more pragmatic view on most subjects. Gone are the radical sentiments of his previous manifesto, such as the violent attacks on the Austrian nobility, which he always considered useless, lazy and obstructive. Instead, there are considered proposals for military reform, dealing with Hungarian obstinacy, and how to handle the international situation. In his biographer Derek Beale's words, by 1768 Joseph stands forth not as a wild, unpractical zealot, nor a ruthless despot, but as a reforming statesman working conscientiously, knowledgeably and rationally within the existing system to strengthen the state and benefit its people. With Joseph accepting a more limited reform agenda in the domestic arena, he next turned to foreign policy. Despite the failure to recover Silesia, Austria had theoretically held a strong position at the end of the 7 Years' War. Prussia was, though not beaten, very much a broken power. The Austro-French Entente was still intact, whilst the London-Berlin axis had collapsed. Frederick responded to his diplomatic isolation by forming an alliance with Russia's new Tsarina, Catherine, but it came at a price. Prussia, which had fought so hard for its survival as a great power, in effect accepted its relegation to the status of Russian lapdog for the next 2 decades. Frederick's desperation to maintain the compact meant St. Petersburg could count on Prussian support for almost any design. In 1764, Berlin helped Catherine impose her favoured candidate, Stanisław August, on the Polish throne.
Live from New York!
This once mighty state was now racked with internal divisions and treated as an irrelevancy by all of the great nations that it bordered. Catherine's imposition theoretically turned the country into a puppet state. Against this Russo-Prussian alliance, Austria could do little but watch. Then, in 1768, a Russo-Turkish war broke out. Previously, these conflicts had tended to be fairly indecisive affairs. This time, however, Russia won a string of great victories early on. To Austria, and even Russia's ally Prussia, the real possibility of a total Ottoman collapse set off alarm bells. Austrian strategic realities demanded she step in before Russian power expanded too dramatically, even if it meant siding with the hated Turks. But this would then trigger a Prussian entry into the conflict under the terms of Frederick's alliance with Catherine. It was an expansion of the war that neither Prussia or Austria wanted. As such, in 1769, Joseph decided it was past time the Hohenzollerns and Habsburg settled their differences. He had previously written, "If we could ever persuade Frederick that we have genuinely forgotten Silesia, perhaps it would not be impossible to contract with him some solid and useful agreements." So, to the astonishment of Europe, Emperor and King met at Neisse and then again 1 year later at Neustadt. Joseph had long admired his mother's great rival, eagerly endorsing Frederick's conception of the monarch as first servant of the state. He thus got on well with the now aging Prussian king. "After supper we smoked and talked about Voltaire," Joseph wrote to Maria Theresa. Frederick seemed less impressed upon their first meeting. "The young prince," he wrote, "affected a frankness which suited him well. He's desirous of learning, but he has no patience to instruct himself. His exalted position makes him superficial. Boundless ambition devours him. He has enough taste to read Voltaire and appreciate his merits." Yet after the second conference in 1770, Joseph had apparently risen higher in his estimation, and Frederick now wrote a letter praising him. Brought up in a bigoted court, the emperor has discarded superstition. Reared in splendour, he has adopted simple manners. Fed with incense, he is modest. Though this positive opinion may only be because Joseph was not Kaunitz, who this time joined the two monarchs and took the opportunity of meeting his old adversary to hold an impromptu hour-long lecture on the conduct of foreign policy. 2 years later, the king proposed a joint partition of Poland between Prussia, Russia and Austria. By this substitute, he hoped Catherine would be persuaded to lessen her demands on the Ottomans. Austria's inclusion would mean she did not feel threatened by the unilateral expansion of Russian power. Joseph and Kaunitz were in favour, but when asked to co-sign the agreement, Maria Theresa reacted violently against this act of international piracy, preying upon a harmless fellow Catholic nation. She refused, pleaded, begged, and then signed. If she had not done so, Prussia and Russia would have gone ahead anyway, explained Kaunitz and Joseph. Frederick more cynically observed, "She weeps, but she takes." Despite the dramatic results of this brief Austro-Prussian détente, the end of Russia's war with the Turks brought an end to cooperation here as well. Even if the question of Silesia was settled for now, the interests of both powers in Germany just clashed too frequently for a lasting alliance, a fact Joseph was about to make clear. The aggressive plunder of Polish land was an action completely out of character with traditional methods of Habsburg expansion. It was a trend that was only to continue under the new emperor. For a time, his schemes were restrained by Maria Theresa, but at the end
I found it interesting, yeah. She weeps, but she takes. But, yeah, it's cool to see, well, not cool, but, every time Poland comes up in this frickin' channel, it's either non-existent or just getting screwed over. Like, that's hilarious, but I do find that whole episode very interesting. Joseph, obviously, the whole situation was interesting in that, you know, the Turks were getting their butts kicked, and then it became kind of again, a use of diplomacy without everyone having to straight up fight each other. Though Poland obviously got the short end of the stick from all of that, but still, it was a use of, I guess, diplomacy. And again, Joseph is just very, I guess, like, yeah, he's a reformer, I think is what I would call him so far. Like, he has a lot of reforming ideas, obviously, which clash with Maria. Like, I think he wants to go even further, you know? And it's just interesting just to see the rise of these powers and how they become more familiar with me as time goes on. Like, we know later on, like, Napoleonic Wars and so on, how Austria's doing, so again, it's interesting just seeing all the pieces fall into place so far. And again, Joseph, like, again, is willing to work even with a traditional enemy like Prussia to get something for Austria. So I think that's just a very interesting aspect of his character, you know?
1777, the Elector of Bavaria died childless. Joseph, through a dubious ancient land grant and marriage to his Bavarian second wife, claimed part of the country for himself. He persuaded Maria Theresa to reluctantly assent to the acquisition, and Austrian troops crossed the border to secure his share. In hard-nosed realpolitik terms, the conquest of Bavaria made sense. The Habsburgs had acquired several new Polish and Galician subjects from the recent partition. Adding more Germans to the monarchy would help balance this. Unsurprisingly though, Frederick opposed this
Again, it's the interesting aspect of what makes the Austrian Empire. You have the Hungarians, the Germans, the Austrians, like, again, like, there's a lot to it. A multinational empire, which later on doesn't work so well for them, but it's interesting just to see so many pieces all under one banner, you know? And how he's trying to gain so much more land, but doing it not in an upward conquest way, at least like through war, but just through diplomacy and marriage, and like how he's trying to expand Austria through those means is interesting.
Expansion of Austrian power into Germany. When Joseph refused to back down, he marched an army into Bohemia. Joseph raised a force to meet the Prussians, but knowing his idol's fearsome military reputation, proved reluctant to attack. Frederick, seeing that the Austrians had taken up strong defensive positions, contented himself with feeding his army from Bohemian stores. As this stalemate showed no signs of ending, Maria Theresa undercut her son and privately sent an offer of peace to Frederick, which he accepted. The Prussians withdrew from Bohemia, the Habsburgs from Bavaria. The war had cost 65 million florins, a few thousand Austrian lives, and delivered the Habsburg monarchy nothing but embarrassment. Ending this folly was Maria Theresa's last major act as queen. In November 1780 she fell ill, and on the 29th died surrounded by her children, Joseph among them. He was genuinely moved by his mother's passing, though they had often clashed on policy, to the point both had threatened to resign their positions at various times. No one could have doubted the respect Joseph held her in. Yet if he admired her, he was to make very clear this admiration did not extend to imitation. Nearly 40, about to enter the prime of his life, Joseph was now sole master of the Habsburg Empire. Had he changed from that youthful, arrogant, but also charming and romantic man who had suffered such horrific bereavement? Certainly he had never overcome the loss of Isabella.
Alright, so again, I just want to say RIP Maria. A very interesting but figure that I've really have found, and I'm glad to have found out existed and learned about. But now I'm like interested in seeing what Joseph does with all the power and what decisions he made. I will admit that whole Prussian situation was kind of bad and Maria was needed. I think because the guy was about to fight Frederick and I don't know if it would have went that well. So, you know, mainly just to the fearsomeness of Frederick the Great. So, maybe it was a good idea she stepped in, I think. So now, but it's all him now, unchecked. What will he do, right? Like, that's kind of what I've kind of been waiting for. Like, what will an unchecked guy, like, you know, Joseph do?
For the sake of the dynasty, he had married again in 1765 Josepha, daughter of the Habsburgs' old rival, Charles of Bavaria. Josepha did her best, but Joseph was a detached husband who commented she was too covered in boils for any intimacy. When she also caught smallpox, the emperor did not visit her sickbed. When she died after just 2 years of unhappy marriage, he did not even go to her funeral, and thereafter refused to marry again. His union with Isabella had produced one daughter, Maria Theresa, whom he doted on. Her death in 1770, at the age of just 7, was probably the most brutal loss he ever suffered. From then on, his only love was for the state. He could still be charming, kind and patient to all classes of people. When he toured the Habsburg monarchy early in his reign, he did so dressed as a simple peasant on horseback. Horrified by what he saw, he became still more determined to transform the empire. Petty changes would not do, he declared. The whole must be reformed. And reform remained his ambition. As stated earlier, his views had grown in maturity by 1768, and his more extreme ideas had always been blocked anyway by Maria Theresa. But now, with no one on earth to answer to, the doctrinaire, lacking in tact, keen to push his ideas to logical extremes, with a disregard for human feeling, prejudice and susceptibility, re-emerged. After Joseph initially wrote to Leopold that he intended to only go slowly at first, the pace soon picked up, in everything from minor reform of pension rights for government officials, to making lofty proclamations that Austria needed men able to renounce all of life's pleasures for the sake of the public weal. Maria Theresa had averaged around 100 edicts annually. Joseph managed 700. Power was to be concentrated in the emperor's hands as far as was possible. Provincial government was reduced and streamlined. Local diets lost much of their autonomy, if indeed they were convened at all. Joseph's dislike of the nobility remained strong, but rather than destroy their predominance in government, he chose to instead hector them relentlessly. One grumbled that the emperor gave the impression that he alone loved the country and knew the truth, whilst all his civil servants were fools. Joseph was tactless, but to start with nobody could fault his sincerity. Patents in 1781 forbade nobles from physically punishing their peasants or controlling who they married. Another even announced the abolition of serfdom, the system of bondage that chained peasants to the land. Censorship was also heavily relaxed. In religious affairs, Joseph continued his easing of restrictions on Jews and Protestants. Almost half of the empire's monasteries were dissolved and their property, worth 60 million florins, seized for redistribution to new schools and hospitals. Joseph himself was apparently not an atheist, as has sometimes been suggested, but he did clearly hope to subordinate the church to civil authority. In 1782, Pope Pius VI, hoping to convince Joseph to relent, travelled across the Alps to visit him in Vienna. The emperor complained to Catherine of Russia that he had to spend each day in long conversation with Pius, talking nonsense about theology in words which neither of us understood. For his part, the Pope later compared Joseph to Martin Luther, which prompted the emperor to make a reciprocal visit of conciliation to Rome. Joseph continued to pressure the church, but ultimately decided he could not push matters to an open breach. Besides, there were bigger problems he had to face. For the first few years of his sole reign, Joseph had largely contented himself with managing the Austro-Bohemian section of the empire, which he held the most direct control over. Maria Theresa had created a centralised government really for the first time, but other territories, particularly Hungary, still maintained enormous autonomy. Joseph, however, dreamed of a unified administration with common institutions, language and government, all directed by the emperor in Vienna. To this end, he had refused a Hungarian coronation, which would have meant swearing oaths to defend the country's unique privileges. In 1784, the crown of St. Stephen, symbol of Hungarian sovereignty, was brought from Pressburg to Vienna. A census was ordered ostensibly to bring in the Austrian system of military conscription, but censuses have always been associated with preparing the way for taxation, and thus Joseph's attempt inevitably provoked unrest among the hitherto untaxed Magyar nobility. The replacement of Latin as the language of administration, not with Hungarian but German, was a further insult. Resistance was immediate and deep in this kingdom.
Okay, so like I said, I'm just kind of really interested in the way he's ruling, you know, obviously with the absolutism aspect, and like I said, I'm like wondering how things are going, but I think the biggest challenge so far would be Hungary and its independence, right? They are independent, as we saw with Catherine. She had to like straight up appeal, ask them for help, and they could have said no to her. Like they really are so powerful as a principality, and he's like starting to now, and like Joseph is like a guy who really wants things done in a way. And now that Maria, I'm so sorry, but like Maria isn't there, it's like, I'm wondering if he's about to cause a lot more issues. Like, this seems like he might, I'm not sure if he's gonna have to back down, or if he's actually gonna get the Hungarians to somewhat, see, or like, bring them somewhat to heel, but this is an interesting dynamic. As we know, Hungary still goes on later on to be quite an issue for Austria to deal with, so I don't know.
Where patriotism far outstripped any class interest that the emperor may otherwise have been able to appeal to. Ironically though, it was not Hungarian but Romanian peasants in Transylvania that were the first to actually revolt. The leader, Horia, claimed to be acting in Joseph's name against unjust lords. The emperor replied by deploying troops. The rising was crushed, the peasants felt betrayed, and the landlords believed he had encouraged them in the first place. Hungary was just one example of where, after an initial cautious start, Joseph piled edict on top of edict, initiated reform after reform, rarely consulting anyone and brushing aside opposition nonchalantly. And the worst was yet to come. Not content with domestic revolution, Joseph also looked to make his mark on the international chessboard. Burnt fingers over the Bavarian debacle had not lessened his desire for glory and conquest. His first ploy was to try and open the Scheldt, close to international trade under the terms of a 1713 treaty. The Dutch refused, Joseph's own French ally backed them, and Austria was once more humiliated. He returned to the Bavarian question again.
Yeah, there's something about reforming. Like, yeah, in some aspects you can just go full on with it, but in other aspects I think you need to definitely take it a little easy. I think he probably should have. He's trying to throw it all on, right? The thing is, people don't like change. especially quickly. So the thing is, sometimes you have to ease into it. Now he's just like throwing it all in, and it could come across as disorienting and just like, yeah, and his doesn't seem to like taking probably the more opinions that would contradict his ideas, so that seems to create issues, and it can be a little ineffective. I feel like temperance would go a long way with someone like Joseph, and a bit of patience and playing out the long game, if you would,
hoping to exchange it with the Elector, Charles Theodore, for part of the Austrian Netherlands. Frederick, in his last great act as king, mobilised a league of German princes against the acquisition. For a second time, Joseph was forced to abandon his Bavarian ambitions. Desperate to win glory somewhere, in 1781 he concluded a formal alliance with Catherine, aimed at profiting from rather than checking Russian expansion. The Tsarina, with Prussia already in her power, now had Austria also trying to win her favour. When she annexed Crimea in 1783, something Austria would previously have opposed, Joseph could offer little protest. When yet another Russo-Turkish war broke out in 1787 though, it seemed Joseph might at last have his chance for conquest. But the Russians were slow to mobilise, and a large part of their force was redirected north to deter Swedish manoeuvres. The hoped-for easy victory turned into near disaster when the Ottomans concentrated against Austria and threatened to overrun the Banat region. In crisis, Joseph was forced to recall 7 Years' War hero Ernst Loudon from retirement. The old marshal, now in his 70s, restored Austrian morale, repelled the Turkish assault, and in a brilliant 3-week campaign seized Belgrade. This in October 1789. But the war, its high taxes and harvest of young men had by then brought to boil all the tensions of the previous decade. Attempting to impose the same kind of administrative streamlining on the Austrian Netherlands as he had in the rest of the empire, Joseph provoked such anger that his vice-regal pair, Maria Christine and her husband, suspended the reforms. The emperor rebuked them as being easily manipulated by a few lawyers and priests, and handed control to military commanders. In 1789, part of the province revolted. Because of the war with Turkey, Austria lacked the troops to crush it. Joseph appealed to his French ally, but in 1789 they had their own problems. Back in the hereditary lands, a nobility tired of being insulted, abused and taxed were contemptuous of the emperor's authority. On the streets of Vienna he was openly mocked. The Hungarians were on the verge of a full-scale uprising.
Dang, man. Yeah, I think the lack of tact definitely is not doing him favors. He tried to do too much way too quick. Man. Yeah, you kind of have to be more patient and more of a smooth talker to rule the Austrian Empire, huh? You can't just be like, okay, here's what I'm doing, you all have to do it. Like, it's not like traditional places like, oh, I'm the monarch, you all now do what I say, we're gonna do this. Here he has to like almost, like in his own empire, balance out the different regions and make sure, and like some regions he might directly control, others he had, or almost, even though a part of the Austrian Empire, almost their own powers in a sense, and he has to like almost convince them and play the diplomatic game. What a headache to run. I would not want to rule this, But yeah, this ain't good, and he was too desperate for glory, I think, for conquest, like, got himself in a war and all this, just, not good.
Then, in January 1790, came the final coup de grace when Prussia, sensing opportunity under its new king Frederick William, joined the Ottomans in an offensive alliance. With Berlin's forces poised to sweep into Bohemia, the Habsburg Empire seemed on the verge of total catastrophe. By this point, Joseph II was a shell of a man. His eyes were bloodshot, his nerves wrecked, his nights tormented. He continued to reel off edicts and commands his ministers had long since stopped obeying. Broken and depressed, he revoked all of his Hungarian reforms apart from the abolition of serfdom. then called on Leopold, currently ruling Tuscany, to come and take over the government. He longed for death, and on the 20th of February 1790, aged just 48, death obliged him. Churchill once commented on Curzon's career: the morning had been golden, the noontide was bronze, and the evening was lead. It seems an apt description of this most enigmatic of Habsburg monarchs.
Yeah. At the end there, he completely fell apart. Like, everything just went bad. Holy crap, man. Wow. I admire reformers, I think, but again, it didn't work out for him. Some of his personality traits just weren't suited for what he wanted to accomplish. And yeah, he got Austria in a really bad position, and I have to give it to, like, Maria, his mother. She was in an awful position, but managed to get them out. I think he put them in an alright. He took them from an alright position, and near the end won, completely falling apart. So that's probably that's really not a good stain to have on you, you know?
Joseph undoubtedly had all the assets of a great king. Intelligent, generous, attuned to the problems of his realm, with a grand vision for its future. Certainly there was nothing necessarily unique about many of his aims. Frederick and Catherine both held to some vague conception of enlightened absolutism, and Joseph's principles, a centralised, efficient, rational and meritocratic Habsburg monarchy, have indeed attracted many admirers. Why then did he fail? The simplest explanation is that these ambitions could never be forced upon the Habsburg domains from on high in such a short space of time. How could Joseph try to impose almost total centralisation on a monarchy with as many different laws, parliaments and traditions as this one? How could a political body that was still using Latin as an administrative language be made efficient through a few decrees? How could a multi-ethnic empire, bound together entirely because of chance inheritances from centuries prior, be made rational? He tried to do in 10 years what required a century of patient work. He mistook vindictiveness to nobles for egalitarian principle, believed a state-shackled religion could provide for the subtler needs of the human soul. He thought his reforms helped the peasant, but how could they ever love a man who abused their pope, mocked their traditions and sent them to the slaughter in pointless wars? He knew nothing of the politician's art of the possible. Yet in the end it is hard not to have sympathy with this man. So long in the shadow of his great mother, plagued by tragedy in his personal life, in a century of dull, uninspiring and inadequate monarchs, one could admire Joseph's drive, energy and ambition. Whatever laments can be written for his reign, though, does not change the fact that in 1790 the Habsburg Empire was on the verge of complete disintegration, just as a new threat to the European order arose in the West. It would take a monarch of supreme ability to rescue it. Fortunately, one was about to arrive in Vienna.
So yeah, overall I think he really nailed a lot of the faults of him. He tried to do too much too quickly, like I said earlier, and again, I can see why he's polarizing. There are some aspects I do like about him, some of his thoughts I do like, but execution-wise, not the best, I have to say, unfortunately. But, oh well. So, I'm gonna end the video right here. I think we covered mainly everything we did, and we'll continue with Old Britannia tomorrow, so bye everyone.